Why would the United States ever consider detonating a nuclear bomb on the moon? How close did this plan actually come to becoming reality? And what does it say about the Cold War that this was even considered in the first place? My friends, you're going to like this one. At first glance, the title of the research paper sounded harmless. A study of lunar research flights, Volume 1, the kind of document easy to overlook, bland, technical, almost forgettable. And that may have been exactly the point, because a closer look told a very different story. Printed on the cover was a symbol, an atom, a nuclear explosion, and a mushroom cloud, the emblem of the Air Force Special Weapons Center at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, a division deeply involved in the development and testing of nuclear weapons. This wasn't just a scientific study, it was a proposal, a classified plan developed during one of the most tense periods in modern history. In the late 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, the United States explored a project known as Project A119. The objective? Detonate a nuclear bomb on the surface of the moon. The project was led by physicist Leonard Reifel, a scientist who had worked alongside Enrico Fermi, often referred to as the architect of the nuclear age. Reifel was tasked by the US Air Force with determining whether such a mission was even possible. Between May of 1958 and January of 1959, his team produced multiple reports analysing the logistics, risks, and potential outcomes of such an operation. And their conclusion was striking. It could be done. Even more surprising, among the scientists contributing to the project was a young graduate student whose name would later become widely recognised, Carl Sagan. At the time, Sagan's role involved calculating how dust and debris would behave in the moon's low gravity, specifically whether the explosion would create a visible plume, something that could be seen from Earth. Because visibility was the point. Here is the interesting part. The existence of Project A119 remained hidden for decades. It was only discovered in the 1990s when Sagan mentioned the work in an application for an academic position, revealing a government secret that had never been intended for public knowledge. So why would the United States even consider something like this? To understand that, you have to go back to the late 1950s. At that moment in history, the Cold War wasn't just a political conflict, it was a psychological one. And sometimes psychological warfare was more effective. The competition for dominance that played out not only through weapons and technology, but through perception. And in many ways, the United States felt like it was falling behind. In 1952, the US had detonated the world's first hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than the atomic bombs used in World War II. But just 3 years later, the Soviet Union achieved the same milestone. Then, in 1957, the Soviets delivered another shock. They launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It was a small metallic sphere, but its impact was enormous. Because Sputnik wasn't just a satellite, it was proof. Proof that the Soviet Union possessed rocket technology capable of reaching space and potentially delivering nuclear weapons across continents. And there was another detail that made the situation even worse. Sputnik had been launched using an intercontinental ballistic missile, which meant the same technology, placing objects in orbit, could also be used for nuclear warfare. The message was clear. The Soviets were ahead. Meanwhile, the United States attempted to respond with its own satellite program. The result was a failure that would become one of the most publicly embarrassing moments of the early space race. The Vanguard rocket exploded shortly after liftoff. The explosion was captured on film and broadcast around the world. A fiery collapse, a visible failure. Newspapers described it as a major setback in both prestige and propaganda. At a time when global perception mattered deeply, the United States had just lost ground. And that loss created pressure to respond, pressure to prove technological superiority, and pressure to do something dramatic. Rumours began circulating that the Soviet Union might take an even more extreme step. Some reports suggested the Soviets were planning to detonate a nuclear device on the moon to mark the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Whether those rumours were true remains unclear, but their effect was very real. Because around the same time, the United States began seriously exploring the exact same idea. Project A119 was not simply about science, it was about spectacle. If a nuclear explosion could be seen from Earth, if a flash appeared on the surface of the Moon, it would serve as undeniable proof of American capability, a demonstration visible to the entire world. But as the project developed, the technical challenges became clearer. The Moon has no atmosphere. That means explosions behave very differently than they do on Earth. There would be no shockwaves spreading through air, no towering mushroom cloud in the traditional sense. Scientists needed to determine whether the explosion would even be visible. They studied how dust would spread across the lunar surface, how light would reflect in the absence of atmosphere, and whether the resulting plume would create a detectable flash from Earth. At the same time, serious concerns began to emerge. What if the rocket failed during launch? What if the nuclear device detonated prematurely? What if it fell back to Earth? Even a small error could result in catastrophe. There were also ethical concerns. Some scientists questioned the idea of permanently altering the Moon's surface. Others worried about the long-term consequences of contaminating a celestial body. But in the context of the Cold War, those concerns were not always the priority. Demonstrating power often outweighed preserving environments, especially ones that seemed distant and unreachable. Interestingly, the Soviet Union continued to explore this concept under a program known as E4. Like Project A119, it involved the possibility of detonating a nuclear device on the Moon. And like the American plan, it was eventually abandoned for one simple reason. The risk was too high. Soviet officials concluded that a failed launch could result in the weapon falling back onto their own territory, creating what they described as a highly undesirable international incident. In other words, the danger of failure outweighed the potential benefit of success. Years later, Leonard Riefel confirmed that Project A119 had been taken seriously. He stated that the explosion would have been visible from Earth, and that the plan had been technically feasible. But despite that feasibility, the project was never carried out. Historians have since described proposals like this as part of a broader pattern during the early space race, a time when governments explored bold, sometimes extreme ideas in an effort to define what the space age would become. Ideas that were not always practical, but were designed to capture attention, to impress, to send a message. But as the 1960s progressed, the direction of that message began to change, because while one path involved detonating a nuclear weapon on the Moon, another path offered something far more powerful: reaching it. Instead of destroying part of the Moon, the United States chose to land on it. In 1969, Apollo 11 successfully placed humans on the lunar surface. A moment watched by millions, a demonstration not of destruction, but of achievement. And Project A119 quietly faded into history. But the story doesn't end there, because even today, the idea raises questions. Could something like this happen again? International agreements now exist to prevent the weaponization of space. Treaties signed by multiple nations prohibit the placement of nuclear weapons beyond Earth. But as technology advances and new players enter the space race, those boundaries may one day be tested again. Because history has shown something interesting. When new frontiers open, ambition follows, and not all ideas remain theoretical. So if a plan like Project A119 could exist, if scientists and military leaders once seriously considered detonating a nuclear weapon on the Moon, what other ideas were proposed, studied, and were never revealed? Because sometimes the most fascinating mysteries aren't the ones that happened, they're the ones that almost did.